For 3 long years, a chilling rule haunted the cold stone halls of Blackmoor Castle: never, ever go near the Alpha King's daughter. The servants whispered that the little girl was cursed, that she was the reason the preen was dead, and the reason the fearsome king's heart had turned to solid ice. To cross into her forbidden corridor was to invite the wrath of a monster. But when a fragile new chambermaid heard a muffled sob echoing from the shadows, she didn't run away. Instead, she did the one thing that could cost her everything. She reached out. The first thing Claire noticed about Blackmoor Castle was that it smelled of stone and old smoke, and that nobody looked her in the eye. She stood in the great hall with her sack over one shoulder, twisting the hem of her new woolen apron between her fingers. The apron was stiff and gray, issued by the castle steward, and it smelled faintly of lye. Behind her, the heavy oak doors had already swung shut, sealing her inside a world that felt twice as old and 3 times as cold as Thornwood Village. A plump woman with iron-gray hair and a face like a well-worn ledger approached her, hands on her hips. "So, you're the girl from Thornwood," the woman said. It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am, Claire. Claire of Thornwood." "Mabel," the woman said shortly, "Castle steward. You'll answer to me and only to me until I decide you're worth answering to anyone else." She looked Claire up and down the way a farmer inspects a new hen. "You're thin. Can you carry firewood?" "Yes, ma'am." "Can you scrub a floor until you can see your own face in it?" "Yes, ma'am." "Can you keep your mouth shut about what you see in this castle?" Claire hesitated for half a breath. "I can try, ma'am." Mabel's mouth twitched, almost a smile, almost not. "Good. A chatty sparrow doesn't survive the winter in this castle." She turned and walked, expecting Claire to follow. Claire hurried after her, her boots echoing too loudly on the flagstones. The castle was a maze of winding staircases and narrow corridors, each one colder than the last. Mabel pointed out the kitchen, the great hall, the chapel, the servants' quarters. Her voice was brisk, practical, and utterly devoid of warmth. Claire's head spun. You tried to memorize the turns, the landmarks, the way the light fell through certain windows, but it all layered, fimped, blurred together into stone and shadow. "And that corridor," Mabel said, stopping at the mouth of a narrow passage, "is off limits. That's the old Queen's garden wing. Nobody goes there, not you, not me, not anyone. Understood?" Claire nodded, though she could not see anything but darkness beyond the archway. "Good." Mabel turned and led her up a final flight of stairs to a small door at the end of a drafty hall. "Your room. It's small, but it's yours. Supper is at 6 in the kitchen. Don't be late." And then she was gone, leaving Claire alone with her sack and the sound of wind rattling the shutters. The room was barely larger than a closet, with a narrow bed, a wooden stool, and a tiny window that looked out over the courtyard. Claire set down her sack and sat on the edge of the bed, which creaked under her weight. She pulled out the one thing she had brought from home that mattered, a smooth white river stone, round and cool in her palm, worn soft by years of holding. Her mother's stone, the only thing she had left of her. Claire closed her eyes and pressed the stone to her chest, the way she had done every night for the past 6 years. "I'm here now, Mama," she whispered. "I'll make you proud." She did not cry. She had learned long ago that crying did not bring people back, and it did not fill an empty stomach, and it did not make the world any kinder. But it was hard, sitting in that cold little room, knowing that the nearest person who loved her was 6 miles away, beneath the ground. A bell rang somewhere below. 6 o'clock. Supper. Claire tucked the stone back into her pocket, smoothed her apron, and made her way down to the kitchen. Cook, a broad-shouldered woman with flour up to her elbows, ladled her a bowl of thin barley soup and slid a hunk of dark bread at Thinkasfaddle. "Eat fast," she said. "There's a fire to lay in the east wing after." The soup was lukewarm and barely salted, but Claire ate it like it was the finest meal in the world. She had not eaten since dawn, and her stomach had been growling since the 3rd hour of her walk to the castle. She finished the bread, wiped her mouth on her sleeve, and asked, "Where's the east wing?" Cook pointed with her ladle. "Up the main stairs. Turn left. Follow the draft. You'll know it by the cold." Claire found the east wing easily enough. It was a long corridor lined with doors, each one closed, each one silent. The cold here was sharper, biting through her thin apron. She found the fireplace at the end of the hall, a great stone hearth filled with ash and half-burnt logs, and she knelt down to lay the fire. She was so focused on her work, arranging the kindling, striking the flint, coaxing a small flame to life, that she did not hear the door open behind her. She did not hear the soft footsteps. She only heard, a moment too late, the sharp snap of something hitting the stone floor near her knee. She flinched and turned. A child stood in the doorway of the last room in the corridor. She was small, no more than 7 years old, with pale hair that hung in tangled curtains around a thin, sharp face. She wore a gray dress that was too big for her, and she was barefoot, her toes curling against the cold stones. In one hand, she clutched a battered rabbit puppet with a torn ear. But it was her eyes that stopped Claire's heart. They were deep blue, the same deep blue as the autumn sky before a storm, and they were full of something Claire had never seen in a child's face before. Not fear, not anger, something older, heavier, like grief that had been packed down too tight for too long. The girl did not speak. She did not move. She just stood there staring at Claire with those terrible ancient eyes. Claire's mouth went dry. She forced a smile, the same smile she used on skittish horses and frightened dogs. "Hello," she said softly. "I'm Claire. I'm new here. I didn't mean to startle you." The girl did not respond. Claire glanced down at the stone that had landed by her knee, a small, smooth pebble, the kind a child might pick up in a courtyard. She looked back at the girl. "Did you throw that?" The girl's chin lifted a fraction of an inch. It was not a nod. Not exactly, but it was an acknowledgement. "Why?" Claire asked gently. "Are you angry with me?" The girl's lips pressed together. Her grip on the rabbit puppet tightened, and then, without a sound, she turned and slipped back into her room, closing the door behind her with a soft click. Claire sat there, on the cold stone floor, the fire crackling beside her, and stared at the closed door. A shadow moved at the far end of the corridor. Claire looked up. A man stood there, tall and broad-shouldered, wrapped in a dark cloak with a fur collar. The light from the new fire caught his face, strong-boned, weathered, with a deep scar cutting through his left eyebrow. His hair was dark gray, beginning to silver at the temples. His eyes, even from this distance, were the same deep blue as the girl's. He did not speak. He did not move. He simply stood in the shadows, watching the closed door with an expression Claire could not read. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away, his footsteps fading into the darkness. Claire sat there for a long time, her heart pounding, the fire burning low. She had been in the castle for less than a day, and already she had seen more sorrow than she had seen in a year in Hornwood. She did not know then what she would come to know in the weeks ahead. She did not know that the girl in the gray dress was the Alpha King's daughter, and that she had not spoken a single word in 3 years. She did not know that the man in the shadows was Edward of House Blackmoor, the feared ruler of this cold northern land, and that he was afraid of his own child. But she knew one thing, deep in her bones, with a certainty that made her chest ache. That girl was not angry. That girl was lonely. And Claire, who had been lonely herself for as long as she could remember, knew exactly what that felt like. She finished laying the fire, banked it carefully, and stood up. Her knees were stiff from kneeling on the cold stone. She brushed the ash from her apron and started back toward the servants' stairs. But she stopped at the door to the girl's room. She stood there for a moment, her hand hovering over the wood. She could hear faintly through the thick oak a sound so soft she almost missed it. A muffled, hiccuping sob. Claire's throat tightened. She wanted to knock. She wanted to push the door open and sit on the edge of the bed and say, "It's all right. I'm here." But she did not. She had been in the castle for less than a day, and she was just a chambermaid from Thornwood, and she did not know the rules of this place yet. So she pressed her palm flat against the wood, as if she could pass warmth through it, and she whispered, "It's all right. I'm here." Then she turned and walked away, leaving the girl alone in the dark with her rabbit puppet and her silent tears. The wind rattled the shutters. Somewhere below, a dog barked. The castle settled into its cold, ancient silence, and in the small room at the end of the corridor, a little girl with storm-blue eyes clutched a battered rabbit to her chest and wept without a sound, the way she had wept every night for 3 years. Neither of them knew it yet, but something had begun to change. It would not happen quickly. It would not happen easily, but it had begun. Claire woke before dawn, her breath clouding in the cold air of the servants' loft. For a moment she did not know where she was, then she heard the distant clatter of pots from the kitchen below, and she remembered. Blackmoor Castle, her new life. She reached under her pillow and closed her fingers around the smooth white stone, holding it until the familiar weight settled her heart. She dressed quickly, pinning her chestnut braid flat against her head, and made her way down the winding stone stairs to the great kitchen. The fire was already roaring, and a dozen servants moved through the steam with practiced efficiency. Mabel stood at the long oak table, barking orders and pointing a wooden spoon like a general directing a battle. "There you are, girl. Sleep well?" Mabel did not wait for an answer. "You'll be on the east wing again, wood stacked by the door, and mind you don't drip ash on the rushes. The master hates a sloppy floor." Claire nodded and took the heavy iron bucket, but before she could leave, Mabel caught her wrist. The old woman's grip was surprisingly strong. "One more thing, the little one's room is at the end of that corridor. You'll pass it twice a day, maybe more. You'll hear things. You'll see things." Mabel's eyes, sharp as winter ice, held Claire's for a long moment. "Let them be. You hear me? That child is not your business." Claire opened her mouth to ask why, but Mabel had already turned away, shouting at a boy who had dropped a basket of onions. The east wing was quiet, the way it had been. The evening before, Claire went about her work, stacking wood, laying kindling, striking flint until the fires caught. She worked carefully, methodically, but her mind kept drifting to the small door at the end of the hall, the one with the iron latch and the faded paint. Around midday, she saw the girl. It was just a flash of movement through a gap in the curtains of the solar window. A small figure in a gray wool dress, slipping across the inner courtyard with her head down. She was heading toward the old orchard where the apple tree stood bare and skeletal against the gray sky. Claire watched her go, noticing how the few servants who crossed her path stepped wide, as if she carried some invisible illness. An old gardener raking leaves near the wall spat on the ground when the girl passed. "There she goes," he muttered to no one in particular. "The little crow, mark my words, she'll bring the winter sickness down on us all." Claire felt something hot rise in her chest. She did not know the girl. She did not know why the girl had thrown a stone at her, but she knew what it felt like to be looked at that way, to be whispered about, to be treated as something to be avoided. She had been 11 when her mother died, and the village children had stopped speaking to her altogether, as if grief were a thing that could be caught. She turned away from the window and went back to her work, but the image of the small gray figure stayed with her. That evening, after the supper pots were scoured and the kitchen fires were banked, Claire found herself back in the east wing. She had no more fires to lay, no more floors to sweep, but she had noticed something that morning. When she had passed the little room at the end of the corridor, the door had been slightly ajar, just a crack, no wider than her thumb, and in that crack she had glimpsed a small face with storm-blue eyes, watching her. The moment their eyes met, the door had shut with a quiet click. Now she stood in the corridor again, a small clay pot in her hands. It was filled with hot broth from the supper kettle, and she had wrapped a piece of her honey oat bread in a clean linen cloth. She hesitated, feeling foolish. The girl had thrown a stone at her. The girl had made it very clear she wanted no one near. But Claire remembered the sound of weeping through that door. She remembered the way the small shoulders had shaken in the lamplight. She set the pot and the bread on the floor, just outside the door, where the girl could not miss them. She did not knock. She did not speak. She simply turned and walked back down the corridor, her heart hammering in her chest, half expecting to hear the door open and the pot hurled after her. She heard nothing. The next morning the pot was gone. The linen cloth was gone. In their place on the cold stone floor lay a single smooth blue pebble, no bigger than the last joint of her thumb, Claire picked it up and held it in her palm. It was cold, but it felt like a gift. She slipped it into her apron pocket and went about her work, and she did not tell anyone, not even Mabel. It was a small thing, a tiny thing, a pebble on a windowsill in a vast cold castle, but it was something. It was a door left ajar, and Claire intended to walk through it, however slowly. That evening she returned to the east wing with another pot of broth and another piece of bread. She did not knock. She simply set them down and left. And when she came back the next morning, the pot was empty, and a small gray feather lay in its place. She smiled, and something warm kindled into her chest that had nothing to do with the fires she had lit. On the third evening, the door opened while she was still there. Claire froze, the empty pot in her hands. The girl stood in the doorway, the battered rabbit clutched under one arm, her storm-blue eyes fixed on Claire with an intensity that made her breath catch. She was a small thing, thin and pale, with hair the color of dark honey that hung in tangled ropes around her shoulders. Her dress was clean but worn, and her bare feet were red from the cold stone floor. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then the girl reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out something small and brown. She held it out, her arm trembling, her eyes never leaving Claire's face. It was a dried apple, wrinkled and sweet-smelling, from the autumn harvest. Claire knelt down slowly, so that her eyes were level with the girl's. She held out her hand, palm up, and the girl placed the apple in it with the solemnity of a queen bestowing a crown. "Thank you," Claire said softly. "I'll save it for a special day." The girl's lips parted slightly. For a moment Claire thought she might speak, but then the girl looked down at her rabbit, and her mouth closed, and she stepped back into the room and shut the door. It was not much. It was barely anything. But when Claire walked back down the corridor that night, she felt as if she were carrying a lamp through a dark hall. Mabel was waiting for her at the bottom of the stairs, arms crossed, mouth set in a thin line. "You've been feeding the little one," she said. It was not a question. Claire did not lie. "Yes." Mabel let out a long breath through her nose. She looked tired, older than she had seemed that morning. "I told you to let her be. She was hungry," Claire said simply. "Not my quo. Hand's son Hassel is hungry. Get surgeon." "Girl, that's not the point." Mabel stepped closer, lowering her voice. "The master has made his wishes known. The child is to be left to her nurse. No one is to interfere. Do you understand what that means?" Claire thought of the gray feather, the blue pebble, the dried apple pressed into her palm. She thought of the way the girl's hand had trembled. "I understand," she said. Mabel studied her for a long moment. Then, to Claire's surprise, the old woman's expression softened. "Just a fraction. Listen to me, because I won't say it twice," Mabel said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That child hasn't spoken a word since her mother passed. 3 years, not one word. The nurse, Greta, she's given up. She feeds the girl, dresses her, but there's no love in it. And the master," Mabel shook her head, "the master can't even look at her. He blames himself, though. He'll never say it. He thinks the girl blames him, too." Claire's throat tightened. "Does she?" Mabel's eyes were old and knowing. "I don't think the girl blames anyone. I think she's just waiting for someone to stay. Someone to stay." The words echoed in Claire's chest as she climbed the stairs to the loft. She lay down on her straw pallet and pulled the thin blanket up to her chin. She took the white stone from under her pillow and held it against her heart, and she thought of her mother, and of the years she had spent waiting for someone to stay. No one had stayed. Not really. And she had learned, the hard way, what that silence did to a person. She closed her eyes and made a quiet promise to the dark. She would not be the one to leave. The wind howled around the castle walls that night, and snow began to fall, the first real snow of the season, blanketing the courtyard in soft, white silence. And in the small room at the end of the east wing, a little girl sat by her window, watching the snow fall, with a battered rabbit in her arms, and for the first time in 3 years, a full belly, and a heart that did not feel quite so alone. The morning after the first snow, Claire woke to a world that had gone quiet and white. The courtyard lay blanketed under a soft, thick layer of snow, and the castle walls seemed to hold their breath against the cold. She dressed quickly, her breath fogging in the chill air, and hurried down to the kitchens to collect the day's bread and a small pot of honey. Mabel was already there, stirring a kettle, by the fire, her broad back to the door. She did not turn around when Claire entered, but she spoke, as if she had known all along who was coming. "You were out late last night," Mabel said. "I heard the stairs creak." Claire's cheeks flushed. She had been careful, so careful, but the old housekeeper missed nothing. "I couldn't sleep," she said, which was not quite a lie. Mabel turned then, and her weathered face was unreadable. She studied Claire for a long moment, and then she sighed, the kind of sigh that carried the weight of too many winters. "Listen to me, girl," she said, her voice lower now. "I told you to stay away from the child, and I meant it, but I also told you that no one has tried in 3 years, and I meant that too." She paused, and something softened in her eyes. "If you are going to keep leaving things at that door, at least leave them when the hall is empty. The wrong ears hear everything in this castle." Claire nodded, her throat tight. She wanted to thank her, but the words felt too big, too clumsy, so she just said, "I will," and picked up the bread and honey, and left before Mabel could change one think. In the east wing was quiet that morning, hushed and cold. The servants had already been through, and the torches had burned down to low, smoking embers. Claire walked slowly past the doors, listening to the silence, and when she reached the last door at the end of the hall, she stopped. She had not planned to stop. She had planned to walk straight past, to go about her duties, to be sensible, but her feet would not carry her any further. She knelt down, setting the bread and honey on the cold stone floor, and she was about to turn away when she noticed something small and dark lying in the shadow of the doorframe. A ribbon. A scrap of dark blue velvet frayed at the edges, no longer than her finger. It had not been there the night before. Claire picked it up and turned it over in her hands. It was soft, worn smooth from years of being touched, and she knew, without knowing how she knew, that it had belonged to someone Lily had loved. She tucked it into her pocket, her heart aching with a tenderness she could not name. She worked the rest of the morning in a haze, sweeping floors and hauling firewood. But the ribbon weighed against her heart, and the thought of the little girl in that cold room would not leave her alone. She had seen Lily only 3 times, and each time the girl had been alone, always alone, with only a battered rabbit for company. And that rabbit. Something about that rabbit had been bothering her all night. She found herself in the early afternoon standing outside the door to the children's quarters. The room had been empty for years, ever since the Queen had died, but someone kept it tidy and the door was never locked. Claire slipped inside, her heart pounding, and closed the doors softly behind her. The room was small and dim, with a narrow vent against one wall and a heavy oak chest at its foot. The curtains were drawn, and the air smelled of dust and old wood. Claire crossed to the window and pulled the curtain back, just enough to let in a thin slice of gray light, and then she turned, and there it was. Mr. Whiskers lay on the pillow, propped up as if someone had set him there with care. He was a sorry thing, faded and lumpy, with button eyes that did not match, and fur that had been rubbed in patches, and his right ear hung at a sad, crooked angle, held on by only a few frayed threads. Claire picked him up gently, the way she would have picked up a sleeping bird. The stitches were old and clumsy, done by a hand that had been in a hurry, or a hand that had been shaking. She turned the rabbit over, and her breath caught in her throat. There, on the underside of the torn ear, was a small, careful embroidery. A tiny heart, worked in faded red thread, so small it was almost hidden. It was the kind of thing a mother might sew into a child's toy, a secret mark of love that no one else would ever see. Claire sat down on the edge of the bed, the rabbit cradled in her hands, and she felt something crack open in her chest. She had lost her own mother when she was young, and she knew what it was to hold on to a thing that smelled like her, that felt like her, that was all that was left. She knew what it was to be afraid that if the thing broke, the last piece of her mother would be gone. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the blue ribbon. It was not much, but it was soft, and it was clean, and it was the right color. She would need a needle and thread, and she would need to be careful, so careful, not to disturb the little red heart. She found what she needed in the servants' workroom, a small wooden box. Think the apple sheetles and thread that Mabel kept for mending the castle linens. She took a spool of dark thread and a needle, and she sat by the window in the fading afternoon light, and she began to sew. It took her longer than she had expected. The ear had to be lined up just so, and the stitches had to be small and even, and she kept stopping to check that she was not covering the tiny red heart. She worked slowly, carefully, the way she had watched her mother work when she was a child, and she thought about the woman who had sewn that heart, and about the little girl who had held this rabbit through 3 long winters alone. When she finished, she held Mr. Whiskers up to the light. The ear was straight now, held firmly in place with neat dark stitches. The little red heart was still visible, just below the seam, and the blue ribbon had been worked into the fold of the ear so that it looked like a small, soft patch of color against the faded gray fur. She smoothed the rabbit's fur with her thumb, and then she carried him back to the children's quarters and laid him gently on the pillow, exactly where she had found him. She stood there for a moment looking at the little rabbit propped against the pillow, and she said out loud, "To no one, there, now he won't fall apart." She turned to leave, and the door was open. Not wide open, but open. A crack. A sliver of dim light from the hallway falling across the floor, and in that sliver of light, just at the threshold, was a small worn shoe. Claire's heart stopped. She looked up, and there, pressed against the doorframe, half hidden in the shadow of the hall, was Lily. The girl was wearing a thin gray dress too light for the cold, and her dark hair was tangled around her face. She was staring at the pillow at the spot where Mr. W. Whiskers lay, and her small hands were clenched at her sides. Claire did not move. She did not speak. She just stood there, holding her breath, and waited. Lily's eyes traveled from the pillow to Claire's face, and for a long, terrible moment, neither of them moved. Then Lily took a step into the room, just one step, and she looked at Claire, and her eyes were wet, and her lips parted, and Claire thought, for one wild, desperate heartbeat, that she was going to speak. But she did not. She just looked at Claire, and then she looked at Mr. Whiskers, and then she turned and ran, her bare feet silent on the cold stone floor, disappearing down the hall like a ghost. Claire stood there for a long time, her heart pounding, her hands shaking. The door was still open. It was still open. She walked out into the hall, and the snow was falling again, soft and silent, drifting past the windows. She walked to the end of the hall, to the window that looked out over the courtyard, and she saw, in the thin gray light, a small figure standing alone in the snow. Lily was standing in the middle of the courtyard, her arms wrapped around herself, her face turned up to the sky. The snow was falling on her hair, on her shoulders, and she did not seem to feel it. She just stood there, small and still, like a little bird that had been left behind. Claire watched her for a long moment, and then she turned and went back to the servants' workroom, and she found a spare shawl, and she carried it down to the courtyard, walking slowly so as not to frighten her. She did not say anything when she reached her. She just draped the shawl over Lily's thin shoulders. And then she knelt down in the snow beside her, and she looked up at the sky too. The snow fell around them, soft and quiet, and neither of them moved. After a long moment, Lily's hand crept out from under the shawl, and her small, cold fingers brushed against Claire's hand. Just a touch, just a breath of contact. And then her hand was gone, tucked back under the shawl, and she was still looking up at the sky. But she did not run away. And when Claire finally rose to go back inside, her knees aching from the cold, she looked back over her shoulder and saw that Lily had turned to watch her go. The girl was holding the shawl close around her, and her face was unreadable, but she was looking at Claire, really looking at her. Claire smiled, just a little, and then she turned and walked back into the castle. That night she left another bowl of soup outside Lily's door, and a small piece of honey bread wrapped in a clean cloth. She did not wait to see if it would be taken. She went straight to her loft, and she lay down on her straw pallet, and she held her white stone against her heart. She thought about the little red heart sewn into the rabbit's ear, and about the small, cold hand that had touched hers in the snow, and about the door that had been left open. She closed her eyes, and she let herself believe, just for a moment, that maybe, this time, someone would stay. In the small room at the end of the east wing, Lily sat on her bed, Mr. Whiskers clutched against her chest. She had not taken off the shawl. She was running her thumb over and over, across the neat, dark stitches that held her rabbit's ear in place. And in the morning, when Claire went to collect the empty bowl, she found a small, white stone lying on the threshold. Not a blue one, a white one, round and smooth, like the one she kept under her own pillow. Lily had given her something of her own. The snow came again that night, thicker than before. And by morning the whole courtyard lay under a soft white blanket. Claire stood at the kitchen window with a bowl of porridge in her hands, watching the flakes drift past the gray stone walls, and she thought about the small, cold hand that had touched hers the day before. She had not slept well. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Lily standing in the snow without a shawl, her thin shoulders trembling, her dark eyes watching the world as if it were something to be afraid of. And every time she woke, she reached under her pillow and touched the white stone the girl had left for her. It sat there now, round and smooth and cold, next to the one her mother had given her long ago. 2 white stones, 2 small weights of trust. Mabel came up behind her and peered over her shoulder at the snow. "You'll catch your death staring out that window," the old woman said. "Porridge won't stir itself." Claire turned, and she tried to smile. "Is it all right if I take a little time in the courtyard this morning?" Mabel's eyebrows rose. "The courtyard? In this cold? What for?" "I just thought maybe I could clear a path by the east wing." The snows drifted deep there. It was not entirely a lie. The path by the east wing did need clearing, but Claire had seen, through the frost on the window, that the small figure in the gray dress had already made her way down to the courtyard before anyone else was awake. Lily had stood at the edge of the snow, her hands wrapped around herself, and she had looked at the white expanse, as if she wanted to step into it, but did not know how. Mabel studied her for a long moment, then she sighed and waved a hand. "Take the broom then. But mind you, that girl's been down there since dawn. Don't you go bothering her." Claire nodded, and she took the broom, and she went out into the cold. The snow came up past her ankles, and the air bit at her cheeks until they stung. She made her way across the yard toward the east wing, sweeping as she went, leaving a dark path behind her in the white. And there, at the edge of the courtyard, stood Lily. The girl had not moved. She stood perfectly still, her arms wrapped around her thin body, and she was watching the snow fall with an expression that Claire could not quite read. Not sadness exactly, something older than sadness. Something that had learned, long ago, not to expect anything good. Claire did not call out, she did not wave, she simply kept sweeping, slowly, making her way in a wide arc around the girl, leaving a clean path through the snow, and when she was close enough to speak without raising her voice, she stopped. "It's good snow for building," she said, as if she were talking to herself. "My mother used to say that the best snow is the kind that falls in the morning, before the sun gets a chance to melt it. It packs together just right." Lily did not turn, but Claire saw the girl's shoulders shift just a little. Claire set down the broom and she crouched and she scooped up a handful of snow. She packed it between her palms until it formed a rough, lopsided ball, and she set it on the ground and began to roll it forward. The snow clung to itself, growing larger and larger, until she had a fat, clumsy base for a snowman's body. She did not look at Lily. She kept her eyes on her work and she talked in a low, easy voice, the way she might talk to a nervous cat. "My mother used to say that snowmen are the only company that never talks back," she said. "That was the best part," she said. "You could tell a snowman anything, and he'd just stand there and listen, and he'd never tell anybody." She packed another ball, smaller, and set it on top of the first. She found 2 small stones for eyes, and she pressed them into the snow, and she stood back to admire her work. "Not bad," she said. "He needs a nose, though, and arms. And maybe a scarf, if he's going to be proper." She glanced, finally, at Lily. The girl had not moved from her spot, but her eyes were fixed on the snowman, and there was something in them that had not been there before. A flicker. A small, bright thing. Claire smiled and she held out her hand. "You can help if you like," she said. "He needs a nose. I think there might be a good stick over by the wall." Lily looked at her hand. She looked at the snowman, and then, slowly, she took a step forward, then another, and another, until she was standing right beside Claire, close enough that Claire could feel the cold radiating off her small body. Claire did not reach for her. She simply turned and walked toward the wall, and she heard the soft crunch of small footsteps following her. They found a good stick for the nose, and a shorter one for a smile, and 2 more for arms. Lily carried them all back to the snowman herself, her arms full, her cheeks flushed with cold, and when Claire stepped back to let her place the nose, the girl hesitated, and then she pushed the stick into the snowman's face with a careful, deliberate little motion. Claire clapped her hands together. "Perfect," she said. "He looks like he's smiling." Lily looked at the snowman and her lips moved. Just a flicker, just a tiny curve at the corner of her mouth. And then it was gone, and she looked down at her boots, as if she had been caught doing something she should not have done. Claire did not say anything about it. She simply crouched down and began to pat the snow around the snowman's base, packing it tight. "He needs a name," she said. "Every proper snowman needs a name. What do you think? Something grand? Something like Sir Snowbottom or Lord Frostbite or—" She heard it before she saw it. A sharp, high voice cutting through the cold like a blade. "Girl!" Claire straightened and turned. A woman stood at the edge of the courtyard, wrapped in a heavy gray cloak, her face pinched and sour. She had the look of someone who had been in service for a long time and had let it harden her into something sharp and brittle. "Girl, what do you think you're doing?" the woman demanded, striding toward them. "Have you lost your wits? That is the king's daughter. You do not touch her. You do not speak to her. You do not—" Claire stepped back, her hands still wet and cold. We were just—" "Do not lie to me." The woman's eyes flicked to Lily, and something in them softened, just for a moment before hardening again. "She is not to be bothered. Do you understand me? The king has given orders. She is to be left alone." Lily had gone very still. The snowman stood between them, lopsided and silent, and the girl was staring at the ground, her shoulders hunched, as if she were trying to make herself small enough to disappear. Claire's heart ached. She wanted to say something, to push back, to tell this woman that the girl was not a thing to be locked away, but she remembered Mabel's words, and she bit her tongue. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. I didn't mean to overstep." The woman sniffed. "See that you don't again." She turned to Lily, and her voice softened, just a little. "Come, child, you'll catch your death out here." Lily did not move. She stood beside the snowman, and she looked at the woman, and then she looked at Claire. And then very slowly she reached out and touched the snowman's stick arm as if to say, "I made this. This is mine." The woman's face tightened. "Now," she said, more firmly, "the king will not want you out here. Come inside." Lily's hand dropped. She followed the woman, her small feet leaving deep prints in the snow, and she did not look back. But as she reached the door, she paused, just for a moment, and she looked over her shoulder at the snowman, and Claire saw it. A small, quick smile. The first real smile she had seen on that girl's face. It was gone in an instant, and then Lily was gone too, swallowed by the dark doorway of the east wing. Claire stood alone in the courtyard, the snow falling around her, and she looked at the snowman with his crooked smile and his stick arms and his coal stone eyes. He looked silly. He looked lopsided. He looked, she thought, a little bit like Hope. She did not see the figure standing at the high window of the great hall watching. She did not see the tall man in the dark cloak, his hand pressed against the cold glass, his deep blue eyes fixed on the small girl who had smiled at a snowman made by a chambermaid. She did not hear him say very quietly to no one at all she smiled. And she did not see him turn away from the window, his hand still pressed to the glass, his jaw tight, as if he was fighting something he had not felt in a very long time. That night, when Claire went to the east wing to collect the empty bowl, she found it full of clean water, as if it had been left out to catch the snow. And beside it, lying on the threshold, was a small gray stone, not blue, not white, gray, the color of the winter sky. Lily had left her something again, and this time Claire did not know what it meant. She picked it up anyway, and she slipped it into her pocket, and she held it against her palm all the way back to her loft. She did not know that the woman in the gray cloak was standing in the shadows of the corridor, watching her go, and she did not know that the woman was already turning, already walking toward the great hall, already rehearsing the words she would say to the king about the new chambermaid who had dared to touch his daughter. The great hall was cold that night, colder than it had any right to be with the fire roaring in the hearth. Edward stood with his back to the flames, his hands clasped behind him, and he listened to Greta's report with a face that gave nothing away. The old nurse had been thorough. She spoke of the snowman, of the chambermaid crouching in the snow like a common child, of the princess being coaxed out of her rooms against all established custom. She spoke of Mr. Whiskers, of the mended ear, of the bowl of soup that had appeared on the threshold night after night, as if the girl were trying to feed a stray cat. "She has overstepped, my lord," Greta finished, her voice flat. "I thought you should know." Edward did not turn around. He stared into the fire for a long moment, and he saw, again, the image he had been trying to push away all evening. His daughter, her cheeks pink with cold, her hands covered in snow, her mouth curved into something that was almost, no, not almost, it was a smile, a real smile, the first one in 3 years. Has she harmed the child? He asked, his voice low. No, my lord, but she has. Has she frightened her? Greta hesitated. No, my lord, but she has no training, no understanding of court. Greta. Edward turned, and his voice was quiet, but the old nurse fell silent at once. You have served this house for 30 years. You have my thanks, but I will speak with the girl myself. He dismissed her with a nod, and he waited until her footsteps had faded down the corridor before he let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. He did not summon Claire to the great hall. He did not want the formality of thrones and titles between them. Instead, he went to her. He found her in the narrow servants' corridor that ran behind the kitchens, a candle in one hand and a stack of folded linens in the other, and she nearly dropped the whole pile when she saw him. My lord, she breathed, dipping into a clumsy curtsy. The linens wobbled. One of them slid off the top, and she caught it against her chest with her elbow, her face flushing red. I did not expect— Walk with me, Edward said. He did not wait for an answer. He turned and led her down the corridor, past the kitchens, past the scullery, until they came to a small, unused antechamber that overlooked the inner courtyard. The snow had stopped falling. The sky was clear and full of stars, and the snowman stood below them, a pale shape in the moonlight, its carrot nose crooked but proud. Edward stopped at the window. He did not look at her. He looked at the snowman. You built that, he said. It was not a question. With her, Claire said quietly. She chose the nose. She would not let me put it on crooked. Edward's jaw tightened. He remembered the way his daughter had reached up, her small hands pressing the carrot into the snowman's face, tilting it just so. He had been too far away to hear her laugh, but he had seen her mouth move, and he had seen Claire laugh with her, and something in his chest had cracked open like ice breaking on a river. You have been told, Edward said slowly, that no one goes near her, that she is to be left alone. Yes, my lord. And yet you went anyway. Claire was silent for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was small, but it did not shake. She was lonely, my lord. Edward turned to look at her then. He took in the mended dress, the chapped hands, the way she held the linens against her chest like a shield. She was nobody, a village girl from Thornwood, hired to scrub floors and carry water. She had no rank, no power, no reason to care about his daughter. And yet she had built a snowman. She had mended a rabbit. She had left soup on the threshold, night after night, without asking for anything in return. I am told, Edward said, that you gave her a stone. Claire blinked. A stone, my lord? The gray one. She left it for you, and you kept it. Claire's hand went instinctively to her pocket, where the small gray stone sat warm against her palm. Yes, my lord. She has been leaving me things, little things. A feather, a bit of string, And you keep them? I do, my lord. Why? Claire looked up at him, and for the first time there was no fear in her eyes. There was only a quiet, stubborn tenderness that made Edward's chest ache in a way he had not felt in years. Because, she said, when someone gives you something, even a little thing, it means they are thinking of you. And I think she has not had anyone thinking of her for a very long time. The words hummed between them in the cold, still air. Edward turned back to the window. He looked at the snowman, at the crooked nose, at the lumpy snow arms that his daughter had shaped with her own hands. She smiled, he said, so quietly that Claire almost did not hear it. 3 years. She has not smiled in 3 years, and today she smiled at a snowman. At the snowman, my lord, Claire said softly. Think at herself. She made it. She was proud of it. Edward closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were wet, though he would deny it to anyone who asked. Tomorrow, he said, his voice rough, you will go to her rooms. You will tell her that her father would like to see the snowman with her. From the window, if she wishes. Claire's breath caught. My lord! Do not push her. Do not make her speak. Just tell her that. He paused, and his voice dropped even lower. And if she does not wish to see me, you will tell me honestly, even if it is what I do not want to hear. Yes, my lord, Claire whispered. He dismissed her then, and she curtsied again. And she was halfway to the door when she stopped. She turned back, her hands still in her pocket, and she pulled out the small gray stone. "My lord," she said, "I have something of hers. She left it for me. I thought you should know. I think she was trying to tell me something with it, but I do not know what." Edward looked at the stone. It was smooth and round, the color of the winter sky, and he recognized it at once. He had seen it before, years ago, in his wife's jewelry box. She had collected stones from the river, smooth and perfect, and she had kept them in a velvet pouch. He had not thought of that pouch in 3 years. "Keep it," he said, his voice thick. "She gave it to you. It is yours now." Claire nodded, and she slipped the stone back into her pocket, and she left him standing at the window looking down at the snowman in the moonlight. She did not go straight to her loft. Instead, she went to the east wing, her candle flickering in the draught, and she stopped outside Lily's door. She could hear the child moving inside, a small, restless sound, like a bird shifting on its perch. She knocked, soft and quick. The movement stopped. "Lily," she said, pressing her mouth close to the crack in the door. "It's me. I just wanted you to know. I kept the stone, the gray one. I don't know what it means yet, but I kept it." There was a long pause. Then, so softly that Claire almost missed it, she heard a small hand press against the other side of the door. Claire pressed her own hand to the wood, palm to palm, the way she had seen mothers do with children who could not sleep. "Good night, Lily," she whispered. "I'll be here in the morning. I'm not going anywhere." She turned to go, and she had taken 3 steps when she heard the door open behind her. Not a crack, not a sliver. Open, a hand's width, and Lily stood in the gap, her dark hair tangled, her eyes wide and shining in the candlelight. She did not speak. She did not need to. She reached out, and she caught the edge of Claire's sleeve between her small fingers, and she held on, just for a moment, just long enough for Claire to understand. Then she let go, and she stepped back, and the door closed with a soft click. Claire stood in the corridor, her hand pressed to her chest, her heart so full it hurt. She did not know that Edward was standing at the far end of the hall watching. She did not know that he had seen his daughter reach out, had seen her touch another human being of her own will for the first time in 3 years. She only knew that the gray stone in her pocket felt warm now, warm as a hand held in her own, and that somewhere in the east wing, a little girl was sleeping with her hand pressed flat against the door, dreaming of snowmen and crooked noses and someone who had promised to stay. Mabel found Claire at dawn, standing in the kitchen doorway with a steaming cup of milk in her hands and a look on her face that said "Jish." He had not slept well. "You look like a hen that sat on a stone all night," Mabel said, not unkindly. "What is it? The girl again?" Claire set the cup down. Her hands were steady, but her voice came out smaller than she meant it to. "The king asked me to tell her something. About the snowman, about watching it from his window." Mabel's eyebrows climbed halfway up her forehead. She picked up a cloth and began wiping the same spot on the table over and over, which Claire had learned was her way of thinking. "He asked you? Not Greta, not Aldrich. You." "Yes." "Well." Mabel set the cloth down and looked at Claire with something that might have been respect, or might have been worry. "Then you'd best go tell her before the day gets old, and mind you, if she does not want to hear it, you do not push. You leave the door open and you walk away. That is how it works with hurt children." Claire nodded. She picked up the milk, walked through the cold stone corridors to the east wing, and stopped outside the door she had come to know better than any other in the castle. She knocked twice, soft. "Lily, it's me. I brought you warm milk, and something your father asked me to tell you." Silence. Then, after a long moment, the sound of small feet on the floor, and the door opened just wide enough for a pale face and a pair of dark eyes to peer out. Lily's hair was tangled from sleep. She wore a nightgown that was too big for her. The sleeves rolled up twice. She looked at the cup, then at Claire, then at the cup again. Claire crouched down so they were at eye level. She held out the milk, and Lily took it with both hands, warming her fingers on the clay. "Your father," Claire said carefully, "asked me to tell you that he would like to watch the snowman from his window. He said he thinks Thing is the best snowman he has ever seen, and he would like to look at it for a while. He asked me to ask you if that would be all right." Lily's hands tightened around the cup. For a long moment she did not move, did not blink. Then, very slowly, she nodded. Claire let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. "Good. That is good. He will watch from his window, and you can be in the yard, and it will be like you are both there together, just in different places." She did not say that it was the first time in 3 years Edward had asked to look at anything his daughter had made. She did not say that her own heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She simply smiled, tucked a stray strand of hair behind Lily's ear, and stood up. "Come, I will help you dress. It is cold out, and you will need your warm cloak." An hour later, Claire stood in the courtyard with Lily beside her, both of them stamping their feet against the morning cold. The snowman stood in the corner of the yard, slightly lopsided, with a crooked nose and 2 button eyes that had been there since yesterday afternoon. Lily's eyes kept drifting up to the castle wall, to the row of windows that overlooked the yard. Claire followed her gaze and saw in the 3rd window from the left a tall shadow standing very still. Edward was there. He had pulled the curtain aside just enough to see out, and he was watching them. Claire did not wave. She did not point. She simply knelt beside Lily, picked up a handful of snow, and began packing it into a ball. "Let's make him a friend," she said. "He looks lonely, standing by himself." Lily watched her for a moment. Then she crouched down too, and began patting snow with her mittened hands. They worked in silence for a long time, Claire rolling the blank thing, Lily patting the middle, both of them adding snow where it looked thin. The shadow in the window did not move. It stayed, watching, as the second snowman took shape. When it was done, Claire stood back to admire it. "There," she said, "now he has company. No one should stand alone in the snow." Lily looked at the 2 snowmen, then up at the window. The shadow had shifted, just slightly, and she saw a hand lift and press against the glass. She raised her own hand, small and mittened, and pressed it against the air in the same direction. It was not quite a wave. It was not quite anything. But the shadow did not move away. Claire felt something hot behind her eyes. She blinked it back and said, her voice a little rough, "I think he saw you. I think he is glad." The rest of the morning passed quietly. Claire helped Lily brush out her hair, helped her eat a bowl of porridge that she actually finished for the first time in days, and sat with her by the fire while she drew pictures with a piece of charcoal on a scrap of parchment. Lily drew a shape that Claire recognized after a moment, herself, with a braid and a smile. Then next to it she drew a taller shape with a crown, and a smaller shape with a skirt. She looked at it for a long time, then carefully added a 4th shape. A little figure with a nightgown and a rabbit tucked under its arm. Claire did not ask what it meant. She simply said, "That is a beautiful drawing. May I keep it?" Lily hesitated. Then she folded it carefully, pressed it into Claire's palm, and closed Claire's fingers over it with her small, cold hands. Claire tucked it into her apron pocket next to her heart. "Thank you," she said. "I will keep it safe." Veta found them that afternoon in the corridor outside Lily's room. The older woman's face Think from this pinched with disapproval. She stood with her arms crossed, blocking the narrow passage, and looked at Claire the way one looks at a weed that has grown in a carefully tended garden. "You have a lot of nerve," Greta said, her voice low and sharp. "Walking around this castle like you belong here. That child is not yours. She is the king's daughter, and you are a servant who has been here barely a week." Claire stopped. She had known this was coming. She had seen the way Greta watched her, like a hawk watching a mouse. She kept her voice level. "I have not forgotten who she is. I am not trying to take your place." "Then why do you keep going near her?" Greta's eyes narrowed. "She was fine before you came. She stayed in her room. She did not cause trouble. She did not make the king look at her with that sadness in his eyes. And now you have her running out into the snow, drawing pictures, acting like a normal child. You are stirring things up, and I do not like it." Claire felt a flash of anger, hot and quick. She swallowed it down. "She is a normal child," she said quietly. "She has just been hurt. That is not the same as being broken." Greta made a sound of contempt. "You think you know her? I have been looking after that girl since her mother died. I have seen her not speak a single word for 3 years. You have known her for a week. Do not lecture me about what she is." She stepped aside, but only just enough for Claire to pass. "I am watching you," she said, "and so are others. One wrong move and you will be out of this castle before you can pack your things." Claire met her gaze. She did not back down, but she did not argue either. She simply said, "That is your right," and walked past her, her heart pounding. That evening, Claire stood in the doorway of the Grahal watching Edward from across the room. He was sitting at the long table, a cup of wine in his hand, staring at the fire. He looked older than he had yesterday, the lines around his eyes deeper, the gray in his hair more pronounced. She almost turned away, but then he looked up and their eyes met, and she saw something in his face that she had not expected. Hesitation, almost vulnerability. She walked over. She did not curtsy because she had never quite learned how, and he did not seem to expect it. She stopped a few steps from the table and said, "She saw you. At the window. She saw you watching." Edward's hand tightened around his cup. "I know." She raised her hand, Claire said. She pressed it against the air. "Toward you. I think she was trying to say she saw you too." He said nothing for a long moment, then he set the cup down very slowly and looked at her with those deep blue eyes that had seen so much and trusted so little. "Did she smile?" "No," Claire admitted. "But she did not turn away either." Edward nodded. It was a small movement, barely perceptible, but Claire saw the tension in his shoulders ease, just a little. "You told her I would watch from the window," he said. She agreed. "Yes." And she drew a picture. "Of us. Of the three of us." Claire blinked. "How did you—" "I have windows on the east side too." He said it without irony, without apology. "I saw her hand you the paper. I saw her fold it." Claire felt heat rise to her cheeks. She had not known he was watching that closely. "She drew you with a crown," she said a little defensively, "and her mother is not in it." Edward went very still. The fire crackled in the silence. Then he picked up his cup again, took a long drink, and set it down with a soft thud. "Her mother has been gone for 3 years," he said, his voice rough. "Perhaps it is time she stopped drawing her." Claire wanted to say that it was not Lily who needed to stop drawing her mother. It was Edward who needed to stop hiding from the memory. But she did not say it. She had learned, in the past week, that some things could not be said directly. They had to be left in the open, like milk on a windowsill, for someone to take when they were ready. "I will bring her to the yard again tomorrow," she said quietly, "if the snow holds. You are welcome to watch from the window." Edward looked at her for a long moment. Then, to her surprise, he said, "Perhaps I will watch from the door instead." Claire's breath caught. It was a small thing, a tiny step, but it was the first time he had spoken of being near his daughter without being pushed. "That would be good," she said. "She would like that." She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "Claire." She looked back. "Thank you," he said. It was 2 words, quiet and rough, as if he had to force them past a door that had been locked for years. For helping her, for not giving up. Claire smiled, soft and warm. "She is worth not giving up on," she said. "So are you." She left before he could respond, walking quickly down the cold corridor, her heart full to bursting. She did not see Edward sit back in his chair, stare into the fire, and press his hand over his eyes. She did not hear him whisper, very low, "Eleanor, I think she is going to be all right." But she felt it. She felt it in the air, in the warmth that seemed to spread through the cold stone castle, in the way the shadows seemed a little less dark than they had been the night before. The morning came gray and cold, the kind of morning that made the castle stones feel older than they would. "Pest! Ree!" Edward stood in the corridor outside his daughter's room, one hand resting on the doorframe, his breath fogging in the chill air. He had meant to open the door. He had stood there since before the servants began their morning rounds, telling himself that this was the day. But his hand would not move from the frame to the handle. Behind that door, Lily would be waking to another gray morning, and he had no idea what she would see when she looked up. He had promised Claire he would watch from the doorway. He had not promised he would enter. There was a difference, and he held onto it the way a drowning man holds onto a piece of wreckage. He pressed his palm flat against the wood as if he could feel the warmth of her breathing through it. "Lily," he whispered, so low that even he could barely hear it. "I am here. I am just here." He did not open the door, but he did not leave either. He stood there until the morning light crept through the corridor windows, and the sound of footsteps told him the castle was waking. Then he turned and walked away, carrying the weight of his own cowardice like a stone in his chest. Greta found Mabel in the pantry. sorting dried herbs with the precision of a woman who had been doing the same task for 30 years. The old housekeeper did not look up when the door opened, but her hands paused for half a breath. "Greta," Mabel said, in the flat tone of someone who already knew what was coming. "You are up early." "I could not sleep." Greta closed the door behind her, a little too firmly. "Not while that girl is still wandering the castle as if she owns it." Mabel picked up a sprig of rosemary and held it to the light, examining the leaves with exaggerated care. "Which girl would that be?" "You know exactly which girl." Greta's voice. Think things, tight, sharp, as a blade drawn too quickly. "That chambermaid, Claire. She has been filling the little lady's head with all manner of nonsense. I have seen her at the window, waving like a common street performer. I have seen her leave things at the door. She is overstepping her place, and someone has to stop her." Mabel set down the rosemary and finally turned to face the other woman. Her face was unreadable, a weathered mask of years of service. "And what, exactly, has she done that harms the child?" she asked, her voice mild but carrying an edge that only those who knew her well would recognize. Greta hesitated. Just for a moment. "She is filling her head with ideas. The child has begun drawing again. Pictures of people, of the king, of herself with that girl." "Is that a crime?" Mabel asked. "I was under the impression that drawing pictures was a harmless pastime for a lonely child." Greta's face tightened. "You are protecting her. I am protecting the peace of this household," Mabel said, her voice growing firmer. "And I am reminding you that the little lady has not spoken a word in 3 years. Not one. If a chambermaid can make her draw pictures, perhaps a chambermaid is doing something we have all failed to do." Greta's mouth opened, then closed. For a long moment, the two women stood facing each other across the pantry, the air thick with unspoken accusations. Then Greta straightened her shoulders. "I will take this to the king himself if I must. The child is my charge. I have a duty to protect her from those who would influence her." "Do what you must," Mabel said, turning back to her herbs. "But I will tell you what I told you 30 years ago when you first came to this castle. A chatty sparrow does not survive the winter. Choose your battles, Car." Fully. Greta left without another word. But the door did not close softly behind her. It slammed, hard enough to rattle the jars on the shelves. Mabel stood very still for a long moment, staring at the closed door. Then she picked up her rosemary and continued sorting, her hands steady, her heart heavy. Claire did not hear about Greta's visit until that evening, when Mabel found her in the scullery, scrubbing pots with the single-minded focus of a girl trying to keep her hands busy. "Girl?" Mabel said, and the word was gentler than it usually was. "You have made an enemy." Claire looked up, water dripping from her fingers. "Greta?" "Greta." Mabel nodded. "She came to me this morning with a full belly of complaints about you. Says you are filling the little lady's head with nonsense. Says you are overstepping." Claire dried her hands on her apron, slow and deliberate. "What did you tell her?" "I told her that the little lady has not spoken in 3 years, and that if you can make her draw pictures, perhaps you are doing something the rest of us failed to do." Mabel paused. "But Greta is not the kind of woman who gives up easily. She said she will go to the king." Claire's stomach tightened. "Will she?" "I do not know." Mabel stepped closer, and for a moment her gruff exterior cracked, just a little. "I have been in this castle for a long time, girl. I have seen many things. I have seen good people broken by bad words, and bad people lifted by good luck. I do not know what the king will do when Greta speaks to him, but I know this: you have done nothing wrong. Do not let her make you forget that." Claire nodded, her throat tight. "Thank you, Mabel. Do not thank me. Just be careful." Mabel turned to leave, then paused at the door. "And if you are going to keep leaving, hot soup at the little lady's window at night? At least use a warmer pot. That one you have been using goes cold too fast." Claire blinked. "How did you know about that?" Mabel snorted. "I know everything that happens in this castle, girl. I am the one who orders the firewood." She left, the door clicking shut behind her. and Claire was alone with the steam and the silence and the growing fear in her chest. That night, the castle settled into its usual winter quiet. The servants retired to their quarters, the guards took up their posts, and the corridors fell into shadow. Claire waited until the last candle was snuffed and the last footstep faded, then slipped out of her narrow bed and pulled on her shawl. She carried the pot of soup she had made earlier, wrapped in a cloth to keep it warm. It was a small thing, a humble thing, but it had become her nightly ritual. A bowl of warmth left at a window, a small sign that someone remembered. She did not know if Lily ever found it, if the pot was ever emptied, or if it sat untouched until morning. She did it anyway, because it was the only thing she knew how to do. The corridor outside Lily's room was dark, lit only by a single torch that flickered in its bracket, casting long shadows across the stone. Claire moved quietly, her footsteps soft on the cold floor, her breath curling in the air. She reached the window, set down the pot, and was about to turn away when a voice spoke from the shadows. "You do this every night?" She froze. Her heart lurched into her throat, and she spun around, her hand flying to her chest. Edward stepped out of the shadows, his face half lit by the torchlight. He was not wearing his usual armor or cloak, just a simple tunic and a heavy coat, his gray hair disheveled, as if he had been rutting his hectares ting off this through it. He looked tired, more tired than she had ever seen him. "My lord," she breathed, dipping into a quick curtsy. "I did not mean to, I was just—" "You were leaving soup for my daughter," he said it plainly, without judgment, as if he had been watching her do it for a long time, and had only now chosen to speak. Claire's cheeks flushed. "Yes, it is cold at night. The windows in the corridor are drafty. I thought she might— I do not know. I thought she might like something warm." Edward was silent for a long moment. The torch flickered between them, casting dancing shadows across his face. "Why?" he asked, and his voice was rough, almost raw. "Why do you do this? You are a chambermaid. You scrub pots and empty fireplaces. You have no duty to my daughter, no obligation. And yet you leave soup at her window, you build snowmen with her, you give her stones and sing to her in the dark. Why?" Claire looked down at her hands, wrapped in her shawl. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought he must be able to hear it. "Because I know what it is like," she said quietly. "To be alone, to be the one no one comes near. I lost my mother when I was young. I remember what it felt like, to sit in a room full of people and feel like no one could see me. I remember wishing that someone, anyone, would stop and look at me, just look." She looked up and her eyes met his. "I do this because she deserves to be seen. And I thought that maybe, if I kept leaving warmth at her window, she would know that someone sees her, even if it is just a bowl of soup." Edward stared at her. The torchlight caught his eyes, and for a moment she saw something flicker there, something raw and unguarded, like a door opening just a crack. "I know what it is like," he said, and his voice was so low. Think. I am almost missed it. To lose someone, to sit in a room full of people and feel like no one can see you." The silence stretched between them, heavy and fragile, like a thread pulled too taut. Then Edward took a step forward, not toward her, but toward the window. He looked down at the pot of soup she had left there, still warm, still wrapped in its cloth. "She does not speak," he said, almost to himself. "She has not spoken in 3 years. I thought she hated me. I thought I had lost her forever." "She does not hate you," Claire said softly. "She is just hurt, and hurt takes time to heal. But it can heal. I have seen it." Edward looked at her, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Then he said, "Tomorrow morning I will go to her door, not the window. I will stand at her door." Claire's heart swelled. "That is a good first step, my lord." "Will she let me in?" he asked. And the question was so raw, so vulnerable, that it nearly broke her. "I do not know," she said honestly, "but she will see you there, and that is what matters. She will see that you came." Edward nodded slowly. He looked at the pot of soup, then back at her. "Thank you," he said, "for not giving up on her, for not giving up on me." Claire smiled, soft and warm. "You are worth not giving up on, my lord, both of you." She curtsied and turned to leave, but his voice stopped her once more. "Claire." She looked back. "Your mother," he said. "What was her name?" The question caught her off guard. She blinked, and for a moment the old ache rose in her chest. "Margaret," she said. Her name was Margaret. "Margaret," Edward repeated as if committing it to memory. "She raised a good daughter." Claire's eyes stung. She ducked her head, unable to speak, and hurried away down the dark corridor, her heart full to bursting. Behind her, Edward stood alone in the torchlight, looking down at the pot of soup, the warmth still rising from it in thin curls of steam. He did not move for a long time. Then he bent down, picked up the pot, and carried it with him as he walked away, a small warmth against the cold of the night. The morning came gray and cold, the kind of winter morning that made the castle stones seem older than they were. Edward stood in the corridor outside his daughter's door, just as he had promised Claire he would. His hand hovered over the iron latch, and he could hear the soft sounds of movement inside, the creak of a bed, the shuffle of small feet. He had stood here many times over the past 3 years. Always he had turned away before knocking. Always the guilt had been heavier than the need. But this morning he remembered Claire's voice in the dark corridor, because she also hopes someone will stop for her. He let his knuckles rest against the wood, not quite knocking, just touching, as if to say, "I am here." "Lily," he said, his voice low and rough, "I am not going anywhere today. I will be in the great hall if you need me." There was no answer. There never was. But for the first time, he did not walk away immediately. He stood there, counting his breaths, until the silence no longer felt like a wall. Then he turned and walked to the great hall, his boots echoing against the stone. The morning passed in a blur of petitions and ledgers. Edward signed orders for firewood and grain, listened to a dispute between 2 farmers, and approved the repair of a bridge that had collapsed in the first snow. Through it all, his mind kept drifting back to the small figure in the tire room, to the way Claire had looked at him last night as if she truly believed he could be the father his daughter needed. It was nearly midday when Greta appeared before his table, her face pinched with purpose. She curtsied, but her eyes were hard. "My lord," she said, "I must speak with you about the new chambermaid." Edward set down his quill. "The one who mended my daughter's rabbit?" Greta's mouth tightened. "That one, yes. She has overstepped her place. She visits the young lady's room without permission. She brings food and trinkets. She fills the child's head with nonsense about friendship and courage." Edward leaned back in his chair, studying the old nurse. Greta had been with Lily since birth, and he trusted her judgment, but something in her tone grated against him. "What harm has she done?" he asked quietly. Greta hesitated. "The young lady is fragile, my lord. She has not spoken in 3 years. This girl, this village wench, she disturbs the careful order we have built. I request permission to move the young lady to the North Tower where she may recover in peace." The North Tower, cold, isolated, farther from him than she already was. "No," Edward said. Greta blinked. "My lord—" "No," he repeated, his voice harder. "My daughter stays where she is, and the chambermaid is not to be interfered with." Greta's face flushed. She opened her mouth, then closed it, and curtsied stiffly. "As you command, my lord." She left without another word, and Edward stared at the door for a long moment, surprised by the force of his own refusal. He did not entirely understand why he had defended Claire. He only knew that when Greta spoke of her as a village wench, something in his chest had flared with protectiveness. That evening, the snow began to fall again, thick and silent. Edward ate a solitary supper in his chambers. The fire crackly, thinked Lou. He had just poured himself a cup of mulled wine when a sharp knock came at the door. It was Sir Aldrich, his face pale. "My lord," the knight said, "it is the young lady. She has a fever, a high one." Edward's cup clattered to the table, wine spilling across the wood. He did not wait for his cloak. He was already running, his boots pounding down the stone corridor, his heart a wild drum in his chest. He burst into Lily's room to find Claire already there, kneeling by the bed, pressing a cool cloth to the child's forehead. Lily's face was flushed, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The rabbit lay beside her, its mended ear askew, and in her small fist she clutched the white stone Claire had given her. "She has been feverish since dusk," Claire said without looking up. "I sent for the healer. She should be here soon." Edward knelt on the other side of the bed, reaching for his daughter's hand. Her skin was burning. For a moment, the world narrowed to the small figure on the bed, to the sound of her labored breathing. "Lily," he whispered. "Lily." I am here. Father is here. And then, for the first time in 3 years, she spoke. Mother, she breathed, her voice thin and desperate. Mother, do not go. Please do not leave me. Edward's hand froze. The word went through him like a blade. He looked at Claire and she met his gaze, her eyes brimming with tears she did not let fall. She is dreaming, Claire said softly. She is back. In that moment, Edward's throat closed. He had never asked what his daughter had seen that night. He had been too afraid of the answer, but now the answer was spilling out of her in fevered whispers, and he could not turn away. I held her hand, Lily murmured, her brow furrowing. I held it so tight, but she slipped away. She slipped Think. Oh. And I could not hold on. A sob tore from Edward's chest. He bowed his head over his daughter's hand, his shoulders shaking. It was not her fault, he choked out. It was never her fault. Claire moved around the bed, kneeling beside him. She placed a hand on his arm, gentle but firm. She needs to hear you say it, she said. When she wakes, she needs to hear you say it. Edward lifted his head, his face ravaged with grief. What if she wakes and the fever has taken her voice again? What if I've waited too long? Claire looked at him and there was no pity in her eyes, only a fierce, quiet certainty. Then you will say it again tomorrow. And the day after, you will say it until she believes it. The healer arrived then, an elderly woman with steady hands and a leather satchel. She shooed them both back, examining the child with practiced efficiency. Edward stood helplessly by the window, watching the snow fall beyond the glass, while Claire remained at the foot of the bed, a quiet presence. The healer worked through the night, applying compresses and forcing bitter herbal tea between Lily's cracked lips. Edward did not move from his place by the window. He watched his daughter's face, watched the flush slowly recede, watched her breathing ease. At some point, Claire came to stand beside him. She will be all right, she said. She is strong. Edward shook his head slowly. I do not know her strength. I have not been there to see it. Claire was silent for a moment. Then she said, You are here now. That is what matters. He turned to look at her, and in the dim firelight he saw the exhaustion in her face, the smudges of soot on her apron, the way she held herself upright through sheer will. Why do you do this? He asked, his voice raw. Why do you care so much? For a child who is not yours? Claire met his gaze. Because someone once stopped for me, she said. When I was small and lost, someone stopped, and it changed everything. She did not say more, and he did not ask. They stood together in the quiet, watching over the child, and for the first time, Edward felt the walls around his heart begin to crack. Near dawn, Lily's fever broke. The healer pronounced her out of danger and departed with promises to return by midday. Claire sagged with relief. Sinking into a chair by the bed, Edward knelt again, taking his daughter's hand. She was pale but peaceful, her breathing even, the rabbit tucked under her arm. Lily, he whispered, I am going to open the garden, the one your mother loved. I am going to let the light back in. He did not know if she could hear him, but he said it anyway, the words a promise, a vow, a beginning. Behind him, Claire placed a hand on his shoulder. He reached up and covered it with his own, and for a long moment they stayed like that. 3 broken people in a quiet room, waiting for the dawn. The morning came, slowly, gray and cold, the sun struggling to climb past the heavy clouds. In the quiet of the sick room, Claire watched the first pale light touch the window ledge, and she felt as though the whole world had been holding its breath with them. Lily slept on, her face peaceful now, the rabbit tucked beneath her arm. The healer had come and gone before sunrise, pronouncing the fever broken and the danger past. Edward had not moved from the chair beside the bed. His hand rested on the covers near his daughter's shoulder, as if he was afraid to touch her, afraid she might disappear if he did. Claire rose and poured a cup of water from the pitcher. She set it on the small table by the bed within ease. Think reach for when Lily woke. Then she knelt beside Edward's chair, her voice low. My lord, she said softly. The garden? You promised her? He looked at her, and for a moment she saw something she had never seen in the Alpha King's eyes before. He looked frightened. Not of battle, not of any enemy, but of a small patch of earth behind a locked door, and the words that might be waiting there. I have not opened that door in 3 years, he said. I do not know what I will find. Then let me go with you, Claire said. You do not have to face it alone. He was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded and rose, and together they walked out of the sick room, down the long corridor, toward the east wing of the castle, where a heavy oak door had been sealed with iron bands and a padlock the size of a man's fist. The key hung on a hook in Edward's private study, where it had hung untouched for 3 years. He took it down now, turning it over in his palm, and Claire saw that his hand trembled. "I planted those roses myself," he said quietly. "Eleanor loved them. She used to say that a garden was the only place where she could hear herself think. When she was gone, I could not bear to look at them. So I locked the door, and told myself it was to keep the memories out." "But it kept the light out too," Claire said. He looked at her, and something in his eyes softened. "Yes," he said. "It did." They walked to the east wing, Sir Aldrich following a few paces behind, silent as always. The oak door stood at the end of a narrow corridor, dust settling thick on its frame. No one had come this way in years. The servants had learned to avoid it, and the castle had learned to forget it existed. Edward fitted the key into the lock. It turned with a groan, as though the metal itself was been reluctant to let the past in. The padlock fell away and he pushed the door open. The garden was not dead. That was the first thing Claire noticed, and it made her heart ache. The roses had grown wild, tangling over the stone walls and climbing the old trellis. Weeds had choked the paths, and the fountain in the center had long since run dry. But the roses were still there, stubborn and alive, their leaves turned bronze with the coming winter, a few brave blooms clinging to the branches. Edward stood in the doorway and he did not move. He stared at the garden as though he had been struck, and Claire saw his jaw tighten, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "She used to sit here," he said, his voice rough. "On that bench, by the fountain. She would read to Lily, and I would come out and find them both asleep in the sun, the book open on her lap. I used to think, this is what peace looks like, this is what a life looks like." He walked forward, his boots crunching on the dry leaves. Claire followed, keeping a few steps behind, giving him the space to remember. At the foot of the bench, half buried in dead leaves, there was a small wooden box. It was weathered and gray, its hinges rusted, but it had been placed carefully, deliberately, as though someone had meant for it to be found. Edward knelt and picked it up. His hands shook as he lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in a scrap of blue silk, was a letter. The paper was yellowed with age, the ink faded, but the handwriting was clear and elegant, the letter slightly uneven as though written by a hand that was already growing weak. Edward read it in silence. Claire watched his face change, the lines around his eyes deepening, the grief rising like a tide. When he finished, he bowed his head and a sound escaped him, low and honking, like the last breath of a wounded animal. "Edward," Claire said softly. Using his name for the first time, she knelt beside him and placed a hand on his arm. "What does it say?" He did not answer at first. He held the letter out to her and she took it carefully, reading the faded words. "My dearest Edward, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and I am sorry, not for leaving, for that was never my choice, but for the words I did not say while I still could. Do not blame Lily. I know the whispers have already begun. The cruel words about the child who brought death to her mother's door. I know because I heard them, and I wept for her. She was holding my hand when I went, my brave little girl, my heart. She did not take me from this world. She gave me the only gift that mattered, the gift of being loved until the very end. I am writing this so that you will know the truth, and so that you will tell her, when she is old enough to understand, there is no curse on her, no shadow that follows her. She is a child of light, and she always was. Lily will not speak. I have seen this coming, in the way she withdraws, in the way she holds her rabbit and says nothing. She thinks she failed me. She thinks her small hands could have held me to this world if only she had tried harder. It is not true, Edward. It was never true, but she will not believe it from me. Because I am gone, she will need you to say it. She will need you to hold her and tell her that she is not a curse, that she never was, that her mother loved her beyond measure, and that I am proud of the woman she will grow to be. Please, my love, open the garden. Let the light back in. Let our daughter see that even the places we lock away can bloom again. I love you. I loved you from the first moment you walked in. right to the rose garden and told me you had never seen anything so beautiful, and I was too shy to tell you that I meant to kiss you before the summer was out. I will be waiting for you, whenever you are ready. I will be watching over our girl, and I will not rest until I see her smile. Yours, always. Eleanor Clare finished reading, and her own eyes filled with tears. She looked up at Edward, who sat on the ground now, the letter clutched in both hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She knew, he said, his voice breaking. She knew Lily would not speak. And she knew I would lock myself away, and she still believed I would find this. She believed I would come back. She knew you, Claire said gently. She knew the man you are, not the one you became when you were grieving. And she was right, Edward. You came back. He looked at her, and there was something raw and open in his eyes, a wound that had finally been lanced, the poison allowed to drain. I have to tell Lily, he said. I have to tell her everything. I have to make her understand. Then let us go, Claire said. She is waiting for you. They walked back through the castle, the letter safe in Edward's pocket, his hand now steady. When they reached the sick room, the door was slightly ajar, and Claire heard a small sound from inside. A voice, a child's voice, soft and uncertain. Papa? Edward stopped as though he had been turned to stone. The word hung in the air, small and fragile. The first word his daughter had spoken in 3 years, and it was not Mama. It was him. It was his name for her. It was Papa. He pushed the door open, and there she was, sitting up in bed, pale but awake, her dark hair tangled, the rabbit clutched against her chest. Her eyes were wide and frightened, and when she saw him, her lip trembled. "Papa," she said again, and this time it was a question, a plea. "Are you angry with me?" Edward crossed the room in 3 strides and knelt by the bed, taking her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing the tears from her cheeks. "No, Lily," he said, and his voice was thick with emotion. "I am not angry. I have never been angry with you. I was angry with myself, for not being there, for not seeing, for leaving you alone when you needed me most." "I tried to hold Mama's hand," Lily whispered. "I tried so hard, but she let go, Papa. She let go, and I could not catch her." "No, sweetheart, no." Edward pulled her into his arms, holding her like she was the most precious thing in the world. Because she was. She did not let go. She was tired, and she had to go. But she loved you with every breath she had. She loved you so much that she wrote a letter. For you, so that you would always know. He drew the letter from his pocket and held it out to her. Lily looked at it, then at him, then at Claire, who stood in the doorway, tears streaming down her face. "Claire," Lily said, and the sound of her name on the child's lips was like music. "You came back?" "Of course I came back," Claire said, her voice thick. "I told you, didn't I? I'm here." Lily reached out a small hand, and Claire crossed the room and took it, kneeling beside Edward so that the 3 of them were together. "Read it to me, Papa," Lily said. "Read me Mama's letter." And so Edward read. His voice was rough and broken at first, but it steadied as he went. And Lily listened, her small hand gripping Claire's, her eyes fixed on her father's face. When he reached the part about the garden, about letting the light back in, she smiled. A small, watery smile, and she looked at Claire. She sighed. "Think I am a child of light," Lily whispered. "Did you hear that, Claire? Mama said I am a child of light." "I heard," Claire said, and she squeezed the small hand in hers. "And she was right. You are." Lily turned and wrapped her arms around her father's neck, burying her face in his shoulder. "I love you, Papa," she said. "I never stopped. I just forgot how to say it." Edward held her, and the tears he had held back for 3 years finally fell. "I love you too, Lily," he said. "I never stopped either, and I am so sorry it took me so long to remember how to say it." They stayed like that for a long time, the 3 of them, while the winter light crept across the floor and the fire crackled in the hearth. And outside the window, the snow began to fall, soft and silent, covering the world in white. The snow melted slowly that year, as if the winter itself was reluctant to let go of the castle it had held so tightly. But spring came anyway, the way it always does, creeping in through the cracks of frozen ground and the bare branches of the orchard trees. By the time the first crocuses pushed their purple heads through the soil by the kitchen door, the whole of Blackmoor Castle seemed to let out a breath it had been holding for a very long time. Claire found Lily in the courtyard on a morning that smelled of wet earth and new grass. The girl was squatting by the old stone fountain, her fingers tracing the moss that had grown thick along its rim. Mr. Whiskers sat propped against her knee, his mended ear catching the pale sunlight. "You are up early," Claire said, settling onto the edge of the fountain beside her. Lily did not look up, but her voice came soft and clear, the way it had every day since the night of the letter. "I wanted to see if the garden was really open." Claire. He followed her gaze to the iron gate at the far end of the courtyard. It stood ajar just a few inches, and beyond it the tangled shadows of the old rose garden waited in the morning light. She had seen Edward go through that gate at dawn, alone, carrying a pair of shears and a length of rope. "He opened it before the snow even finished melting," Claire said. "I saw him out here with a shovel, clearing the path himself." Lily nodded slowly. "He told me I could go in whenever I wanted. He said Mama wanted it to be a place for growing things again." "That sounds like something your mama would have wanted." The girl was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Will you come with me?" Claire felt something warm spread through her chest. She held out her hand and Lily took it without hesitation. Together they crossed the courtyard, their footsteps leaving faint prints in the dew-wet grass, and together they pushed the iron gate wide and stepped into the garden that had been locked for 3 years. It was a mess, of course. The rose bushes had grown wild and tangled, their thorny canes reaching out like grasping hands. The sown path was cracked and overgrown with weeds. The little bench by the center fountain had collapsed on one side, its wood gray with rot. But there were green shoots pushing up through the soil, and the air was thick with the smell of damp earth and something sweet and hopeful. Edward was on his knees by the far wall, his hands black with soil, carefully untangling a climbing rose from a mass of dead brambles. He looked up when he heard them, and Claire saw something in his face that she had never seen before. Not the Alpha King, not the grieving widower, but a man simply at work, doing something he had chosen to do. "Papa," Lily said, and she let go of Claire's hand and ran to him. Edward caught her in his arms, laughing a little, a sound so rare that Claire felt her own breath catch. "Careful, little one, the thorns are still sharp." "I know," Lily said, wrapping her arms around his neck. "You told me, but I wanted to help." Edward looked over his daughter's shoulder at Claire, and his eyes held a quiet thank you that needed no words. He straightened, lifting Lily easily with him, and gestured at the garden around them. "What do you think?" he asked. "A proper mess, isn't it?" "It is beautiful," Lily said, and she meant it. Claire stepped closer, running her fingers along the rough bark of an old apple tree that had somehow survived the neglect. "It just needs someone to tend it," she said. "That is all anything really needs." Edward nodded slowly, and for a moment the three of them stood together in the ruined garden, surrounded by the promise of growth. Then he set Lily down and handed her a small trowel. "Here," he said, "you can dig the holes for the new lavender. I will bring the cuttings from the greenhouse." Lily took the trowel with both hands, her face bright with purpose. "Can Claire help too?" Edward glanced at Claire, and there was a softness in his eyes that made her heart turn over. "If she wants to," he said, "but I thought she might prefer to make tea." Claire laughed, a surprised sound that startled even her. "I can do both," she said. "I will make tea, and then I will help with the lavender." The morning passed in a haze of warm sunlight and good work. Claire brought out a tray of mugs filled with spiced tea, and they drank it sitting on the edge of the collapsed bench, which Edward had propped up with a stack of flat stones. Lily dug holes with more enthusiasm than precision, and Edward patiently showed her how to loosen the soil and set the roots in gently. At noon, Mabel appeared at the garden gate with a basket of bread and cheese. She took one look at the three of them, muddy and content, and she shook her head with a wry smile. "Never thought I would see the day," she said. "The Alpha King on his knees in the dirt, and the little princess with more mud on her face than a pig in a wallow." Lily giggled, a sound that made Mabel's gruff face soften. "It is not mud, Mabel. It is garden soil. Papa said so." "Ah, well then, it is the finest garden soil in all of Fenwick," Mabel said, setting down the basket. "I brought some of my herb tea for the grown-ups. Something to keep the aches away after all this bending over." Edward took a mug gratefully, and Claire watched as he and Mabel exchanged a look of quiet understanding. The old housekeeper had been with the castle for 40 years, had seen 3 kings and countless winters, and she knew better than anyone what it meant to see this particular garden open again. "Greta has settled in at the northern estate," Mabel said, her voice dropping low. "The steward there is strict but fair. She will not trouble anyone again." Edward nodded, his jaw tightening briefly. "Good. I will not have her near Lily." Claire said nothing, but she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The old nurse's cruelty had been a shadow over the castle for so long, and now it was simply gone, packed off to some distant corner where it could do no more harm. The afternoon brought more work and more laughter. Sir Aldrich appeared at the gate, ostensibly to report on the patrol schedule, but Claire noticed that he had a small pouch of dried fish in his hand. He pretended not to see the tabby cat that had appeared on the garden wall, watching him with think, think, think. They penchery amber eyes. You might as well come in and feed it properly," Edward said, and there was a warmth in his voice that had not been there 3 months ago. "No one will mind a cat in the garden." Sir Aldrich looked almost embarrassed, but he stepped through the gate and crouched down. Holding out a piece of fish, the cat jumped down from the wall and wound around his legs, purring loudly enough that even Lily laughed. "His name is Bartholomew," Sir Aldrich said gruffly. "He has been living in the stables for years." "Bartholomew is a fine name," Lily said, crouching down to stroke the cat's gray back. "He looks like a Bartholomew." The cat, as if confirming the judgment, sat down and began to wash its face with great dignity. Even Sir Aldrich cracked a smile. By evening, the garden had begun to take shape. The worst of the brambles were cleared, the path was swept, and a dozen lavender cuttings stood in a neat row, their roots tucked safely into the soil. Edward carried Lily back to the castle on his shoulders, her head drooping with the pleasant exhaustion of a day well spent, and Claire followed behind, her hands smelling of earth and mint. They ate supper in the small sitting room, not the great hall, because Lily had asked for it that way. A simple meal of soup and bread, eaten by the fire with the windows open to the evening air. The sun set late now, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, and the birds sang their evening songs in the trees outside. When the dishes were cleared and Lily had been bathed and dressed in her nightgown, she came to Claire with something held carefully in both hands. "I want to show you something," she said, and she opened her palms. There, nestled in her small hands, were the white, round stone that Claire had given her in the drop sewing since now, and Mr. Whiskers, his mended ears soft with wear. "I am going to put them on the windowsill," Lily said, "so they can watch over me at night, the stone and Mr. Whiskers together." Claire felt her throat tighten. She knelt down so that her eyes were level with the girls. "That sounds like a fine idea," she said. "They will keep each other company." Lily looked at her for a long moment, and then she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Claire's neck, pressing her small face into Claire's shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not being afraid of me." Claire held her, feeling the small warmth of her, the trust that had grown so slowly and so surely. "I was never afraid of you, Lily. I was only afraid I would not be able to help." "You did help," Lily said. "You helped me remember how to talk. And you helped Papa remember how to be my papa." From the doorway there came a soft sound. Claire looked up to see Edward standing there, his hand resting on the doorframe, his eyes bright with unshed tears. He did not speak, but he did not need to. The look on his face said everything. Later, after Lily had fallen asleep with the stone and the rabbit on the windowsill beside her bed, Edward and Claire sat together in the garden, wrapped in cloaks against the cool night air. The moon was rising, round and silver, and the scent of new earth rose around them. "She is going to be all right," Claire said quietly. Edward was silent for a long time. Then he said, "I spent 3 years believing I had failed her, that I had broken something that could never be mended." He turned to look at her, his deep blue eyes catching the moonlight. "I did fail her, but it was not broken, beyond repair. And that is because of you." Claire shook her head. "I only did what anyone would do." "No," Edward said, and his voice was firm. "No one else did. No one else would even go near her. You walked into the storm when everyone else stayed inside. You gave her a stone and you fixed her rabbit and you sat with her in the snow when she could not say a word to you. He reached out and his hand closed around hers, warm and rough with the day's work. That is not nothing, Claire. That is everything. She did not know what to say, so she simply held his hand in the darkness and they sat together in the garden that had been dead and was now alive again, watching the moon climb higher over the castle walls. Spring settled over Blackmoor like a blanket. The garden bloomed in waves, first the crocuses, then the daffodils, then the first tentative buds on the rose bushes. Lily tended her lavender with fierce dedication and she learned to say good morning to the cook and good evening to the stable boy, her voice growing stronger every day. She still had quiet moments, days when the memory of her mother pressed down on her like a stone. But she had learned to let Claire sit beside her in those moments, and she had learned to let her father hold her hand. And on a warm afternoon when the apple tree burst into white blossom, Claire found Edward standing beneath it, looking up at the petals drifting down like snow. "My wife loved this tree," he said. "She used to say that spring was God's way of apologizing for winter." Claire stood beside him, watching the petals fall. "She sounds like she was a wise woman." "She was," Edward said, "and I wasted 3 years being too afraid to remember that." He turned to her, and there was something open and vulnerable in his face that she had never seen before. "I do not want to waste any more time, Claire. I want to live. I want Tibash will think a father to my daughter, and I want you to be part of that life, in whatever way you will have us." Claire felt her heart swell, and she reached out and took his hand, the same hand that had held hers in the garden on that first spring night. "I am not going anywhere," she said. "I promised you. Remember, I am here." They stood together under the apple tree, and the petals fell around them like snow, and somewhere in the castle a little girl was laughing, and the cat Bartholomew was sunning himself on the garden wall, and the world was warm and full and whole. It had taken a long time, and it had taken a brave girl with a white stone and a broken rabbit, and it had taken a father who finally learned to open his heart, but the garden was open now, and it would never be locked again. Sometimes, the thickest ice isn't melted by fire, but by the quietest acts of kindness. Claire proved that a brave, gentle heart can heal even the most broken. Alpha King, would you have dared to knock on that forbidden door? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story warmed your heart, don't forget to like and subscribe for more breathtaking romance.